In 1874, deep in the Appalachian Mountains, they called Martha and Mary Lawson the Justice Twins. They locked their sick father in a barrel and left him to die. But the horrible thing that made them want to get back at him so badly was kept a secret for decades. Two sisters chained up in a root cellar, bleeding after their father's visits, both pregnant with his children. When Martha asked the town preacher for help, he told her to pray more. She begged the deputy marshal, but he said there was no proof. The people in the mountain community knew what was going on, but they didn't want to see it. The sisters agreed in that dark cellar that they would not have any more children, and that their father would never hurt anyone again. The plan was simple, scary, and it would change their lives forever. But this is what no one talks about. Were they doing the right thing when they locked Jeremiah Lawson in that barrel and heard his muffled screams? Or were they becoming the monsters they were trying to get away from? As Martha walked down the narrow wooden steps, the flame of the lantern danced against the stone walls of the root cellar, making shadows that looked like they were alive and full of evil. The cold of November had gotten into every crack in the foundation, making her breath visible. But the quiet made her blood run cold. Mary should have been awake by now and should have yelled when she heard footsteps. There was only the awful silence that had become all too common in the Lawson house. It was the kind of silence that came after her father's late-night trips to places daughters should never go. Martha's bare feet touched the ground, and she lifted the lantern higher. The weak light showed her the horror she had been afraid of finding. Mary was lying crumpled against the far wall, her wrists bleeding and sore from the iron shackles their father had put there the winter before to store preserved meats. But there were no meat hooks here now. Instead, there were the chains that had become Mary's prison whenever Jeremiah Lawson thought his younger daughter needed what he called correction. Mary's thin nightgown was ripped and stained with blood, both dried and fresh. Her dark hair hung in matted tangles across her face, which was so pale that it looked like it was see-through in the flickering light. Martha fell to her knees next to her twin sister and put the lantern on the packed earth floor with shaky hands. Mary's breathing was shallow and uneven, and every time she exhaled, she let out a soft whimper that showed she was in pain that went beyond physical injury. Martha had seen enough of their father's work over the years to know what to look for, but tonight felt different, more violent, as if something fundamental had broken inside the man who should have kept them safe from the very horrors he did. "Mary," Martha whispered, her voice so low that even in the small room it was hard to hear. "Mary, can you hear me?" Her sister's eyes opened, but they were unfocused and glassy with shock. When they finally looked at Martha's face, the twins shared something that didn't need words, a recognition of the pain they had both been feeling for years, but had never felt so completely. Mary tried to talk, but all she could do was cough weakly, which made blood come to her lips. Martha quickly looked at Mary's injuries. Her hands moved quickly and efficiently, like someone who had done this many times before. Even though the cuts were deep, they weren't life-threatening. The bruising around Mary's throat, on the other hand, showed that their father's anger had reached new heights. Mary finally spoke up as Martha washed the worst of the wounds with water from the pitcher their father kept down here for his own sick reasons. Mary whispered, "He said he was disappointed," and each word was clearly hard for her to say.
"Said I wasn't thankful enough for the Lord's gifts."
Martha's jaw tightened as she kept working. Jeremiah Lawson had always used religious language to explain his horrible behavior, using scripture to back up things that no God would ever agree with. But tonight, the way Mary spoke made it seem like their father's excuses had turned into something even worse. "Mary," Martha said, her voice getting stronger as the shock wore off, "I'm pregnant with his child, just like you." The words hung in the cold air between them, like a death sentence. Martha had suspected something was wrong with her for weeks. The morning sickness and missed classes confirmed what she had been trying to deny. But hearing it spoken out loud, knowing that both sisters had been victims of their father's systematic abuse, turned their private horror into a fact that couldn't be denied. Martha fell back on her heels, feeling the weight of their situation more than ever before. They were 18 years old and lived on their father's farm, 5 miles from the nearest neighbor. Their mother had died of tuberculosis 3 years before, so they had no one to protect them. The people who lived in the mountains around them had an unspoken rule to mind their own business. Their father had worked hard to build a reputation as a God-fearing widower, trying to raise two troubled daughters who were prone to wild stories and fits of hysteria. "We have to get out of here," Martha said. But she knew how empty her words sounded as soon as they left her mouth. Where could they go, pregnant and broke, in a world that would see their situation as proof of their own moral failure instead of their father's crime? Mary had a hard time sitting up, and the movement made one of the cuts on her back hurt again. "He's planning something worse, Martha. I heard him talking to himself upstairs before he came down here. He said he was going to keep us until we give him sons, and then—" She shuddered, unable to finish the thought. Martha helped Mary get up and held her sister's weight as they stood together in the dim light of the lantern. Mary's eyes fell on a small, leather-bound journal that had fallen out of its hiding place during the fight. It had fallen out from behind one of the loose stones in the cellar wall. Martha took the journal back with shaking hands, knowing that the careful writing on the open pages belonged to their father. Her face turned white with fear as she read, even worse than what they had already been through. The entries talked about years of careful planning, watching how the girls grew up, and figuring out when to breed them, as if they were animals. There were also entries about other girls in the community, names that Martha knew, and notes about which ones might be good to get in the future. Martha's hands were shaking so much that the journal fell to the ground with a soft thud that sounded like thunder in the cellar. Mary had read enough over Martha's shoulder to know what they were looking at, and when their eyes met again, something important had changed between them. They were no longer just victims who wanted to be saved or get away. They had grown into women who knew that no one would come to help them escape their mountain prison, and that their father's evil was much worse than they had thought. "We're not bringing kids into this world to go through what we've been through," Martha said, her voice sounding harder than usual, which surprised even her. "And we'll make sure he never hurts anyone else." Mary nodded slowly, and her face went from pain to something that looked like determination. At that moment, with proof of their father's cruel behavior all around them, the Lawson sisters made a promise that would shape the rest of their lives. They wouldn't just put up with it or run away. They would make sure that Jeremiah Lawson's reign of terror ended with them, no matter what it cost their souls. The next morning, Martha got up before dawn with a desperate plan in her head after finding something terrible in the cellar. She helped Mary clean her wounds and put on her least ripped dress, while Jeremiah slept off the moonshine he drank every night. The plan was extremely risky, but the journal's revelations left them with no choice but to make one last attempt to get real help before giving up all hope of finding salvation through the right channels. Martha would go into town on market day, when their father was usually busy with his trading duties and could be explained by his absence. Mary would stay behind and say she was sick to avoid suspicion, but her battered state made the lie tragically believable. They both knew that being found out would mean punishment worse than anything they had ever been through. But the other option was to accept a future that promised only more horror. Martha's 5-mile walk to town seemed to go on forever as she made her way along the rough mountain path, rehearsing the carefully worded plea she would make to Reverend Samuel Hayes. The preacher had known their family since before their mother died, had been nice to the sisters after church on Sundays, and would not turn away from such a desperate need. Martha had spent hours planning her approach, knowing she needed to tell enough truth to show how dangerous they were, without being so clear that the Reverend would think she was just being hysterical. She found Reverend Hayes in the small room behind the church where he worked, surrounded by books on theology and letters from the Regional Methodist Conference. He was in his 52nd, thin, and had gray hair that had come in too soon. His hands were soft, like someone who had never worked with their hands. When Martha knocked on his door, dusty from her long walk and clearly upset, he welcomed her with the practiced concern of a shepherd caring for his flock. Martha started off slowly, talking about how her father had become more strict since their mother died, how he tended to punish them violently, and how the sisters were cut off from normal social interaction with kids their age. She hinted at bad behavior without saying what the worst ones were, hoping that the Reverend's experience with troubled families would help him understand what she meant by her carefully chosen words. As Martha's story went on, Reverend Hayes listened with sympathy and nodded, his face becoming more serious. He was quiet for a long time after she was done, and his fingers drummed on the worn wooden desk as he thought about what to say. Martha held her breath, sure that this holy man would see the evil she was talking about and help her or give her a safe place to stay. "Dear child," Reverend Hayes finally said, his voice full of authority, "I can hear the pain in your words, and I know that your father's discipline may seem harsh to a young woman's sensibilities. But we must remember that the Lord commands us to honor our fathers and mothers, no matter how we feel about their methods." As the Reverend spoke, Martha felt something cold settle in her chest. Your father has the hard job of raising 2 daughters without a wife to help him, and living in the mountains can make any man seem stern. What you see as cruelty may just be the firm hand needed to keep young women away from the temptations that come with living in a house without rules. The Reverend leaned forward, his eyes bright with religious fervor. "Child, the Lord works in mysterious ways. Maybe this trial is meant to make your faith stronger and teach you the virtue of submission, which will be important for you as a wife one day. I think you should go home, pray for patience and understanding, and trust that God will take care of your needs in His own time." Martha left the church in shock, her mind echoing the Reverend's words like a death knell for any hope of religious help. But she was so desperate that she tried one last time to get real help. Deputy Marshal Tom Briggs was doing his monthly rounds through the mountain counties, and Martha had heard that he would be at the general store doing official business until late afternoon. She saw the deputy marshal going over tax collection records with the store owner, a stocky man in his 42nds who wore a badge and uniform that showed he was a federal law enforcement officer. Martha was even more careful with him than she had been with the Reverend because she knew that making false accusations against a respected member of the community could get her in trouble with the law. Deputy Briggs listened to her carefully edited story with the professional detachment of someone who is used to hearing complaints and arguments from families who live in remote mountain areas. He asked questions that were organized and based on evidence, witnesses, and paperwork that Martha knew didn't exist. Briggs asked if she could show him her father's journal as proof, which made Martha admit that she had found it by accident and couldn't get it back without raising suspicion. "Miss Lawson," Deputy Briggs said with a tired patience that made it clear he had dealt with complaints like this before, "I know family situations can get tough, especially in small towns. But without witnesses, physical evidence, and your father's reputation as a hard-working and respected member of this community, there's not much the law can do based on your word alone." He paused and looked at Martha's face, which showed a mix of doubt and something like pity. Mountain families often have their own ways of dealing with problems, and young women can sometimes get the wrong idea about strict parental guidance, especially when their condition might make them less able to think clearly. Martha realized that her pregnancy was already showing to careful observers when the deputy mentioned her condition. This hurt her credibility, even though it proved the abuse she was reporting. She knew for sure that the legal system would never help 2 isolated mountain girls whose claims went against the authority of a man who had successfully built up an image of respectability. Martha's trip home was full of despair that got worse with every familiar landmark she passed. The Reverend's advice to accept God's mysterious plan, the deputy's demand for impossible proof, and the general atmosphere of willful ignorance she had found in town, all led to the same terrible conclusion: the outside world would not save them. When she got back, she found Mary lying on the kitchen floor, blood pooling around her. The dangerous herb she had taken in a desperate attempt to end her pregnancy had done a lot of damage to her body. Martha's medical knowledge, which she learned from their mother before she died, was only enough to keep Mary's condition stable. Martha realized that traditional help had not only failed them, but had also pushed Mary to risk her own life instead of facing the future their father had planned. This was when she worked frantically to stop the bleeding and counteract the poison. That night, as Martha sat by Mary's bed and listened to her sister's heavy breathing, all of her hope and any chance of help from outside died. They were really alone, with no help from God's representatives, the law, or the community that had chosen to ignore them rather than get involved. The realization didn't make him sad. Instead, it gave him a terrible clarity that would change everything that came after. After Mary almost died trying to end her pregnancy, the sisters went through a period of careful planning that felt both necessary and wrong. While Mary healed from the wounds she had caused herself, Martha started what she would later call their murder education, studying their father's patterns with the same cold accuracy as a hunter learning how to catch her prey. Jeremiah got up before dawn every day to take care of the animals. He worked in the still deep in the woods behind their property in the afternoons, and by the time he got home at night, he was drunker and drunker on his own product until he passed out in bed around midnight. The sisters used to feel safe for short periods of time when they followed these routines, but now they were the basis for something much worse. Martha found out that their father's moonshine business was based on a group of big wooden barrels that were kept in the old barn. These barrels were strong enough to hold fermenting corn mash for weeks without leaking. The biggest of these barrels was almost 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide. It was made of thick oak staves, held together with iron hoops that Jeremiah had made himself when he was more productive. Martha pretended to help with the still operation while she checked the barrel's construction. She noted how the iron clasps could be locked from the outside and how much weight the container could hold when it was full. The barn was on a slope that went straight to the edge of the cliff behind their house. There, a 100-foot drop ended in a rocky ravine full of mountain laurel and wild plants. The sisters only talked to each other in whispers during this planning stage, when their father was snoring and couldn't hear them. Mary had nightmares that made her gasp and shake. In these dreams, she and Martha turned into creatures as horrible as their father, with bloody hands that no amount of prayer could wash clean. She would wake up talking about divine judgment and eternal damnation, sure that their planned course would send their souls to hell, even if it saved their bodies. Martha listened to these fears with growing anger, saying that letting their father continue his reign of terror would make them responsible for more suffering in the future, and that their own damnation was a small price to pay to protect people they didn't know. Their moral struggle got worse when Martha found their father's journal in the cellar and read aloud parts that talked about how he judged other young women in their community. Jeremiah's journal entries showed that he was very interested in the baker's 15-year-old daughter. He wrote about how she would walk alone to the creek to get watercress for her family's table. Another entry talked about how he saw 2 sisters whose father had died in a mining accident and how they were alone and without a man to protect them. The journal made it clear that Jeremiah didn't plan for the Lawson sisters to be his last victims. They were just the first of many people he planned to prey on as he saw fit. When Jeremiah told them over their small dinner that he had been talking to men from nearby counties about finding good husbands for his daughters, things took a sudden and terrifying turn. When their father explained the arrangements he had made, Martha's initial burst of hope was quickly crushed. He described the potential grooms with such enthusiasm that it became clear what kind of marriages these would be. The men were friends from his moonshine business. They were tough guys who knew that mountain women needed to be handled firmly and who liked fathers who were willing to give them detailed instructions on how to handle their daughters. Jeremiah's description of these men made it clear that he didn't want to give his daughters to protective husbands. Instead, he wanted to work with other predators who thought like him and would keep abusing his victims while letting him keep abusing them. The suggested marriages were more of a way for him to gain more power than to give it up. This would keep Martha and Mary under his control while also adding their future husbands to his network of people who helped him. The wedding plans included specific rules for the husbands to bring their wives to the family home for regular visits, which Jeremiah looked forward to with great excitement. This news took away any last hope that a normal escape might be possible and made the sisters even more ready for their desperate Plan B. Martha started making small changes to their surroundings. For example, she loosened the hinges on the barn door so it would swing more easily when pushed, tested the weight distribution of the moonshine barrel when it was full of different materials, and drew a map of the exact path from the barn to the cliff edge in different weather conditions. She carefully tracked her father's drinking habits, noting that he usually got the most drunk between 2 and 4 in the morning. This gave them a short window of time to carry out their plan. Mary's role in these plans was more mental than physical. Because she was naturally empathetic, she could tell how their father was feeling and guess how he would act. She learned to read the small signs that came before his violent outbursts, knowing when his casual cruelty would turn into something more dangerous. Jeremiah's growing interest in his daughter's pregnancies and comments about the health of his future grandchildren made this information very important. The sisters couldn't fully understand how awful it would be for either of them to think about what he said. The sisters' careful planning came to a head one December night when Jeremiah found proof that Mary had tried to end her pregnancy before. Martha had hidden the rags with blood on them and the container that had held the dangerous herbs, but their father was suspicious and searched the house thoroughly when Mary looked sick, which contradicted her claims of being sick. Jeremiah was so angry when he found out that he went into a rage that was worse than any of his previous violent outbursts. He thought that someone was trying to sabotage his breeding program on purpose, which made him even angrier. Mary was knocked out for several hours after the beating, and Martha was afraid that the wounds would never heal properly. Jeremiah's promise that he would no longer trust his daughter's health to their own judgment and would personally watch over their conditions and do whatever it took to make sure they had successful births was worse than the physical attack. His description of these monitoring measures made it clear that their privacy and freedom would be completely taken away. They would become prisoners in their own home, being watched all the time until they gave birth to the sons he wanted. That night, as Martha sat next to Mary's battered body, listening to her sister's shallow breathing and watching blood seep through new bandages, all of her moral doubts disappeared. They had tried every legal way to get away, but their father's marriage plans meant certain death for them. Now they faced the possibility of being completely imprisoned until their bodies had served his twisted purposes. The horrible clarity that came over Martha during those dark hours turned their desperate plan from something they couldn't imagine into something they had to do that would change the course of their lives forever. On the night of November 23rd, there was no moon, and it was so cold that it seemed to suck the sound out of the air on the mountain. This made the conditions perfect for what the sisters had planned with such terrible precision. Martha had been keeping an eye on the weather for days, knowing they needed total darkness and the first real frost of the season to muffle any sounds that might reach the neighbors. That night, Jeremiah drank even more moonshine than usual to celebrate what he called the successful end of marriage talks that would lead to both of his daughters getting married by Christmas. As he talked about the wedding night instructions he would give their future husbands, his words slurred from alcohol and excitement. Jeremiah's snoring had gotten so deep and rhythmic by 2 a.m. that Martha knew he was in a deep sleep. She woke Mary up with a soft touch, and together they moved through their father's house like ghosts, carefully placing each step to avoid the creaking floorboards they had memorized over years of midnight navigation. Martha held the hemp rope they had made, and Mary held the small bottle of laudanum their mother had left behind. It was a precious gift from her last illness that Martha had been saving for this very purpose. As they had expected, they found their father lying on his bed in his clothes, smelling of corn liquor and the smell of unwashed clothes that had been with him since their mother's death. Martha's hands shook as she mixed the laudanum into the mason jar of moonshine that Jeremiah kept by his bed for breakfast. The clear liquid showed no signs of the extra poison that would make him follow their plan. Mary stood by the door, breathing so shallowly that Martha was afraid her sister would pass out before they could finish their horrible job. The most dangerous part of their plan was moving Jeremiah's unconscious body from the house to the barn, which was almost 50 yards away across open ground. If anyone found them, both sisters would die. They had practiced this move with bags of grain, but their father's dead weight was much harder to deal with than they had thought it would be. Martha held his shoulders, while Mary held his feet. Together, they began the painful process of dragging their father through the cold December night, stopping every few steps to listen for any sign that someone had noticed what they were doing. The barn door swung open with hardly a sound, thanks to the hinges that Martha had loosened on purpose. Inside, she had carefully prepared the moonshine barrel. She took off the iron hoops for a short time so that the oak staves could move apart just enough to fit a person. Then she added more rope to the structure to make it stronger until the original metal bands could be hammered back into place. The sight of their makeshift prison filled both sisters with a fear that went beyond reason. Their desperate plan became an undeniable reality that would change who they were forever. It took both sisters a lot of effort and disgust to lift and fold Jeremiah's limp body into the barrel. As they pushed him through the opening, his body bent at odd angles, and his head fell forward onto his chest, which would have been uncomfortable for anyone who was awake. Martha worked with mechanical precision to replace the iron hoops, using the hammer and chisel she had positioned earlier to secure the metal bands that would turn the container from a simple storage vessel into an unbreakable prison. In the quiet, The sound of metal hitting metal seemed impossibly loud. Each blow echoed through the barn like gunshots that would wake up the whole mountain. But there were no lights in the windows of nearby buildings, and no voices called out in alarm. Slowly, Martha realized that their isolation, which had been a curse for so long, had finally become their protection. Mary stood still the whole time, staring at the barrel with a look of dawning understanding that showed how her soul was starting to break under the weight of what they were doing. Jeremiah started to wake up when Martha sealed the last iron hoop. The laudanum had worn off just enough for him to become aware again. His first sounds were slurred, mumbling, like a drunk man waking up in a strange place and not knowing what to do. But as he slowly became aware of what was going on, his voice changed from confused to alarmed, and then to the authoritative tone he had always used to scare and control his daughters through violence and intimidation. "Martha! Mary! What in the world is going on here? Let me out of this thing right now!" The sound of their father's voice, muffled but clearly angry, hit both sisters like a physical blow. Mary started to shake uncontrollably, and she pressed her hands against her mouth to keep the sobs from giving away their location to anyone who might be listening. Martha felt something deep inside her chest break, like ice cracking under pressure, as the truth of what they had done went from being an idea to being a fact. Jeremiah's demands quickly went from orders to threats, and his voice was just as scary as it had been since they were kids. He threatened them with terrible punishments, told them about the beatings they would get when he got away, and used the power of God and the law to make them do what he wanted. But as the truth of his situation slowly sank in through the fog of alcohol in his mind, his tone began to change to something that sounded like desperation. Martha and Mary worked together to tie the rope harnesses they had made around the barrel in a way that would let them roll their father's prison toward the edge of the cliff. Moving the loaded container took a lot more physical effort than their tests with empty barrels had led them to believe. By the time they got to the barn door, both sisters were crying from the effort. But the slope from the barn to the cliff worked in their favor. As they guided their terrible load down the hill, gravity slowly took over the weight. Jeremiah's voice followed them through the dark, and his words became more and more frantic as he realized where they were going. His threats turned into pleas, and his commanding voice turned into something like panic as he heard his daughter's footsteps getting closer and closer to the cliff. He started calling their names in a way that neither sister had ever heard from him before. He promised to change, begged for forgiveness, and made concessions that would have seemed impossible just a few hours earlier. But Martha was too strong for him to control. Years of pain and the awful things she read in his journal had made her heart hard. As they got closer to the edge, she could hear Mary crying and feel her sister's resolve weakening with each of their father's more and more desperate pleas. But the dark cliff edge, which was clear and final, made Martha's mind clear and cut through all doubt and hesitation. The moment they pushed the barrel over the edge seemed to last forever and no time at all. Their father's prison fell into the darkness below. The silence after the crash seemed to last forever, broken only by their own ragged breathing and the awful realization that they had crossed a line from which they could never come back. The sisters were so shocked on the way back to the house that they couldn't remember the details clearly later. They walked through the dark before dawn like sleepwalkers, their hands still dirty and burned from the ropes and dirt from their terrible work. Their minds were still trying to figure out what they had done. Martha took their father's journal and fed it page by page into the kitchen stove. She watched as years of documented evil turned into ash and smoke. Mary sat still at the kitchen table, staring at her hands as if she had never seen them before. She would sometimes whisper prayers that seemed to get stuck in her throat before she finished. 3 days went by in a strange state of not being normal before Deputy Marshal Briggs showed up to look into reports that Jeremiah Lawson was missing. The sisters had used this time to practice their story over and over, making sure every detail was perfect. They made up a story that would explain their father's disappearance without making people think they were involved. When the deputy finally knocked, both sisters were ready with performances that hid the truth but showed how much it hurt their souls to lie. Deputy Marshal Briggs did a thorough job on his investigation, but he didn't seem very excited about finding out the truth, even if it was uncomfortable. The mountain community's reaction to Jeremiah Lawson's disappearance was shown in careful silences and carefully thought-out explanations that said a lot about what people thought but didn't want to admit. Briggs asked the neighbors about Jeremiah, and they all said the same thing. He was a troubled man who had recently talked about visiting relatives in Kentucky. However, none of them could remember him naming names or places. The owner of the general store remembered selling Jeremiah things he might need for a long trip. The blacksmith remembered hearing Jeremiah talk about looking for new opportunities in faraway places where he could start over. Martha and Mary acted with the skill of actresses who knew their lives depended on convincing an audience that was already ready to believe their story. They said that their father had been getting more and more anxious since the marriage talks. He often talked about how he wanted to look for new places where his future sons-in-law could build their own homes. His leaving in the middle of the night fit with how secretive he was, and how he liked to avoid formal goodbyes that might have made him promise to come back on certain dates. The sisters were right to be worried about his well-being, but they also said that his absence, while unexpected in its timing, was not completely surprising given how he had been acting lately. The search for Jeremiah's remains was done with the kind of half-hearted efficiency that is common in mountain investigations, where the difficult terrain and bad weather made it easy to explain why the results were inconclusive. Deputy Briggs put together search parties that looked along the most obvious paths to nearby counties, but the thick forest below the cliff was still unexplored. Its dangerous undergrowth and steep ravines kept most investigators from going there. The winter snows that came soon after Jeremiah's disappearance sealed the secret forever, burying any proof under layers of ice and fallen leaves that would stay there for years. The sisters started to drift apart in the months after their father's death. This was because they were dealing with the trauma they had been through and the horrible justice they had done in different ways. Martha became more and more alone. She only spoke when she had to, and she moved with a hardness that looked like armor had formed around her bones. She took care of their practical needs with ruthless efficiency, running their small farm with such precision that there was no room for feelings or reflection. During her pregnancy, there was a sense of grim determination, as if she were doing her duty instead of caring for a new life. Mary's reaction to their shared trauma was more spiritual. Her naturally empathetic nature looked for meaning and redemption in dreams and signs that others might have thought were just the result of a troubled mind. She talked a lot about how their mother's spirit would visit them, how angels would talk to them at dawn, and how prophetic dreams seemed to show them the way to a better future. She was in a lot of pain during her pregnancy because she couldn't reconcile her love for the innocent life growing inside her with her disgust at how it got there. Both sisters were preoccupied with what to do about their pregnancies during the long, cold winter months. Each had to make decisions that had moral implications that were too complex for them to fully understand. Mary eventually decided to have her baby, but the birth itself was a way for her to say goodbye to her father's legacy. She went to a faraway settlement where she had heard of a couple who wanted a baby but didn't have one. She gave birth to her son in secret and then gave him to parents who would never know how he was conceived. Mary came home with empty arms and hollow eyes. She had cut off the last physical link to their father's crimes, making sure that an innocent child would grow up without being influenced by his grandfather's evil. Martha's pregnancy ended naturally during a spring storm that seemed to match the violence of her feelings. She thought that her body rejecting the burden it carried was a sign of divine intervention. She bled to death alone in their cabin while Mary was away finding a place for her own child, and she almost died before her sister got back and found her unconscious in a pool of blood. Martha's recovery was slow and made more difficult by infections that made her permanently unable to have children. She accepted this news with the same grim stoicism that had helped her through their darkest times. People in the mountain community slowly came to a decision about the Lawsons sisters through quiet conversations and meaningful looks that showed they understood without saying so. People started to talk about the Justice sisters in quiet conversations about the strange disappearance of Jeremiah Lawson. They spoke with a mix of respect and fear that showed how complicated the community's feelings were about vigilante justice. Some people thought the sisters were heroes who had done what the law and religion couldn't, while others thought they were warning figures whose actions, no matter how justified, had put them outside of civilized society. It took years for the sisters to find their own ways to get closer to redemption by helping others who were in the same situation. Martha found her calling as a midwife, using what she learned while caring for her sick mother and going through her own traumatic miscarriage to help other women through their darkest times. People in the mountain communities began to trust her with secrets and see her as someone who understood suffering in ways that went beyond her job. Women who were in dire situations turned to Martha for help because they knew she would help them without judging them and keep quiet about things that others might find scandalous. Mary's path to healing took her away from their mountain home and into a life of constantly moving between settlements. There, she became known as a storyteller, whose stories had hidden messages about how important it is to protect the innocent. She never talked about her own experiences directly, but her stories always focused on themes of delayed justice, corrupt authority, and the horrible choices people had to make when society didn't protect them. Most of the people who listened to her stories were women and children who gathered around fires at night. They knew that her stories had lessons based on her own experiences with darkness that were too deep for casual conversation. Mary's 65th birthday was the night she spoke to a group of young women in a cabin near the Virginia border. The fire cast dancing shadows across faces that reminded her of herself and Martha at 18. Innocent, but already marked by experiences that hinted at the challenges awaiting them. In a world where women's safety depended largely on the mercy of men who might not possess any. Mary said, "There are times when the only justice we can get is the justice we make ourselves." Her voice was heavy, with years of dealing with moral complexity. But every choice, even the right one, has a price that must be paid for the rest of our lives. The question each of you must answer is whether you can live with that price and whether those you want to protect are worth the cost to your own souls.